Hello, welcome to join the CG webinar and seminar today. The topic today is on what is research culture, interpreting and governing research culture in the UK higher education. We're very delighted to welcome Dr. Justina Bandola-Gill from the University of Birmingham. So Justina is speaking with us in this room. As you can see, as the online people can also see on the screen. And then there's also a group of people joining us in the room as well as online. So welcome to everyone. So I'll do a very brief introduction to Justina. Justina is an assistant professor in social policy at the University of Birmingham, where she leads the science, technology, and culture research cluster. She's a research and research scholar working at the intersection of science policy and research evaluation. As mentioned, today's topic is a very important one, which is about the research culture and different interpretations of that. So the session is recorded, and the recording and transcript will be posted on the CG website in due course. You can also watch the recording on YouTube if you would like to, and if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat area. There will be a Q&A session for both the online audience and the people in this room. So without further ado, I will hand over to Justina for your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online and also in the room. So my presentation today is entitled What is Research Culture? But to be honest, I'm not going to provide any clear answers to that. I think one of the key findings that I've discovered throughout doing this project is that actually in this area, governing and strategy actually outpaces understanding. So none of my interviewees would have a clear answer that they were satisfied with in terms of what is research culture. However, hopefully today, my aim will be to kind of complicate things a little bit and to identify multiple, sometimes competing, sometimes contradictory meanings of research culture that I've identified in the higher education sector. So the context of this project is very much this kind of emergent focus on research culture in the UK, but also internationally. So we see initiatives like COARA and DORA. We see the rise of narrative CVs in the UK, but also across the world, basically, mostly European Union, but also internationally. Funders increasingly not only focus on, but also fund initiatives that are aimed at research culture. So, for example, Wellcome Trust, but also QR funds that are dedicated to research culture. And finally, the most important development, as you will see in my presentation, the REF 2029 with the reshaped environment element, which is now called people, culture, and environment, which really kind of sped up and intensified the debates over research culture in the UK. On kind of less policy, but more kind of implementation side, we see universities in the UK introducing research culture units. We see a spread of research culture leads and managers, strategies and action plans that are being implemented across the UK. So definitely we're witnessing not only kind of policy pressures and policy focus on research culture, but also professionalization and institutionalization of research culture as a governable object. However, when we think about what is research culture, the debates are slightly slower in the sense that there's no kind of one answer that would clearly capture what research culture is. A metaphor that funders and practitioners has been using recently that keeps popping up everywhere is this metaphor of research culture as a ball of spaghetti. So I'm going to ask people in the room, have you heard about research culture as a ball of spaghetti? No. It basically means that if you put your fork in a bowl of spaghetti, you can find different things, right? You can find a piece of meatball, you can find a piece of basil, but you can also find a pasta. And that's basically research culture, right? So depending on where you put your fork, you're going to find something slightly different. It's all very kind of tangled together, mixed up, and it's one big spaghetti mess. However, in my exploration, actually, research culture proved to be something much more difficult than just a bowl of spaghetti, because there are many dimensions of research culture that actually makes it a really difficult object to study, but also to govern. So research culture, like any other culture, is both material and symbolic. So it does have a very specific, tangible parts. You know, when I was talking to my interviewees, they mentioned things like a whiteboard in the corridor as an aspect of research culture, but also we think about kind of symbolic representation and narratives that are involved in research culture. On the other hand, research culture is also aspirational, so it is something that we aim to improve, something that is a kind of ultimate goal, but also reactive, something that needs to be addressed right now and right here. The thing that I found particularly difficult is that unlike other governing objects in the space of research and meta science, research culture is not actually associated with any specific narrowed down practice. So no one is talking about, oh, I'm doing research culture today. Which makes research culture a difficult epistemic, but also difficult governable object. Which makes it complicated when we think about emergence of new audit around research cultures, right? So we don't know what it is, and yet we're going to measure it, we're going to govern it, we're going to incentivize it. So my project focused on this question precisely. So how do different actors and institutions understand the concept of research culture? What types of tensions and contradiction emerge across these different meanings? And finally, is research culture already an auditable object, or is it only emerging as one? So how I approach that question from kind of theoretical standpoint. So I think the kind of baseline assumption that I've made is that research culture doesn't exist. Research culture will exist through our debates, through our conversations, through the language that we use, through the practices that are going to be put in place as a response to these pressures, both from kind of top-down, but also bottom-up initiatives around research culture. And this type of thinking around research culture could be understood through the lens of framing and frames in social sciences. So going all the way back to Goffman, who said that frames are a schemata of interpretations through which actors locate, perceive, identify, and label social reality. So that means that frames are actually central to the processes of sense making. So we make sense of the reality by actually adapting or implementing different frames. Frames could have strategic role in building social movements. So social movements literature is using the concept of frames very widely, almost as a thing as an outcome, right? So we have competing frames that are clashing, frames that are could win or lose. In policy sciences, we even have an approach called frame analysis that was initially developed by Schön and Rhein, which I'm applying to this project. So Schön and Rhein saw frames as ways of selecting, organizing, interpreting, and making sense of complex reality to provide guideposts for knowing, analyzing, persuading, and acting. So seen through this lens, frames are actually actionable. So they are associated with practices and policy solutions. So frames are always linked to what kind of comes out of them. They would shed light on some aspects of the phenomena. They would introduce or incentivize some practices over others, which makes it actually really compatible with the way we think about culture in social sciences. So culture also is seen as a way of kind of making some aspects of reality more visible, more accessible to social actors. Frames could be individual, but it could also be collective. So we can see frames as something that an individual is socialized into using and understanding the world, but also we can see frames as kind of societal level or social group level ways of understanding and making sense of the reality. And finally, frames can be ambiguous to still be productive. So we actually don't have to have a specific answer of what is the problem represented to be in order for us to still engage with the process, for people to kind of collaborate, to work towards solutions, to put all sorts of infrastructures and strategies in place, even though problems are not kind of succinctly defined. And I will use this idea of frame in order to then link it to the idea of auditability, to make something into an object that could be measured, that could be assessed, that could be ranked, and so on. So the literature on emergence of an audit shows that audit actually requires conditions of possibility to emerge, right? So we see audit as a kind of translation of ambiguous policy objects into infrastructure of measurement. From the sociology of quantification, we know that actually measurement is reactive, right? So the institutions and social actors actually respond to audit in specific ways, and measurement is never just an objective act of kind of assessing something, but it will always have social implications in the ways that it will introduce new practices, new institutions, new norms, new values. And finally, these measures are performative. So Donald Mackenzie famously said that measurement is an engine, not a camera, right? So the measurement does not just take a picture of what is being measured, but rather it produces actively new forms of social actions and social institutions. This project captures this concept or auditable object of research culture in the moment of pre-auditability, right? So we don't have the kind of large-scale audit within REF of research culture. So it is a really interesting moment of time in which we can both kind of capture what is out there, the kind of untainted understandings of research culture, but also then we can hopefully compare it once REF 2029 is in place to see what meanings actually disappeared, which meanings have been strengthened. And finally, the theoretical approach that I'm using in this project means that frames and measurement are co-produced. So it means that the framing of research culture can dedicate the types of and approaches to measuring it, but also the way culture is measured in itself is a process of framing it. So a measure, an audit still could be a way of framing the problem and enlightening our understanding of what it is. Okay, and very briefly on the methods. This project is drawing on interviews with academics and professional service members from a research-intensive university. In total, 35 interviews have been conducted, as well as 4 focus groups with academics in engineering and physical sciences, life and environmental sciences, medicine and health, and social sciences. And then I've interviewed 10 funders and decision makers, both from the UK, but also at the European level. And I've analyzed documents of key kind of strategies and policy documents discussing research culture, as well as institutional analysis of Russell Group universities and looking at their research culture strategies, research cultures units, positions, and so on. However, I have to highlight that today I will focus only on kind of definitional struggles as what I've quickly discovered research culture is a very complex phenomenon to study, but also a very complex phenomenon to communicate back. And I simply would require like 5-hour presentation in order to actually capture all the complexity that I've discovered. So today we're just going to focus on definitions. Okay, so how can we make sense of research culture, but also how do participants that I've interviewed and who participated in the focus groups themselves make sense of research culture? I think the baseline message is that research culture was seen as a new term to the interviewees. So all of my interviewees heard the term research culture within the last 5 years only. And the vast majority heard the term for the first time in the last 2 years or less. One of my interviewees even said that the first time they've heard the term research culture was when I invited them for an interview. Surprisingly, professional service members have a much clearer understanding of what research culture is as opposed to academics. So the members of professional services were using the Royal Society definition. They were making references to Wellcome Trust report, whilst academics actually have a much more vague understanding of research culture is, or they explicitly said that this is not something that they've thought about before. The most common contexts in which the term research culture was heard by the interviewees were, of course, REF 2029. That was the kind of predominant area in which they've heard the term, but also interviewees made references to Wellcome Trust report and Wellcome Trust funding for research culture, and a couple of them referred to the government people and culture strategy. Interestingly, when we think about what hasn't been mentioned, the interviewees were not really discussing, for example, their work, their research collaboration, so that was not the term that they would use to actually describe their everyday practice. Generally, they discuss it as difficult to understand, complex, elusive. And one of the team leaders from research office, so the kind of professional services side, actually said that she's not surprised that academics don't know what research culture is, because academics are overwhelmed with so many different kinds of imperatives and agendas from the university and from funders all the time. Research culture is just another label to put over lots of things that they don't ever get to understand clearly as a single thing. So what clearly came out of the interviews is that research culture was seen as a kind of external label that has been added to practices. When the interviewers were discussing what shapes research culture, they were creating this gigantic list of from things like physical spaces, so having a cafe where people can kind of meet and have a coffee, to much more kind of symbolic kind of narratives or issues of representation. So it's all around the place. However, two things that people were discussing across the board was the pandemic and the ref. So I'll talk about the ref in a second. Just a brief mention of the pandemic right now. That was seen as the biggest thing that actually changed research culture in the UK. So people kept mentioning time and again that research culture has been destroyed basically throughout the pandemic, and we never got back to the pre-pandemic levels of interactions, collaborations, and what research culture could be understood. Okay. So, so far I kind of presented a situation in which there's a lot of confusion, complexity, vagueness, that people are not actually clear what research culture is, and yet they have to engage with it, right? Especially if their position now requires them to think about research culture when they're applying for grants that require them a reflection on research culture and so on. And people made sense of this new reality through multiple means. The first one, the kind of straightforward one, was the process of sense-making through concept formulation. And here the interviewees just took the Royal Society's definition and they just said, like, I don't know what research culture is, but there's an existing definition and I'm going to use it. That doesn't mean that the interviewees were particularly happy with that definition. So they're still highlighting shortcomings of this definition. And yet it was seen as like option that is usable and could be just implemented. The second form of sense-making was through professionalization, so from kind of initial secondments to areas that could now be considered research culture to actually taking on dedicated positions, either on academic side or professional services side. People would make sense of what research culture is by looking at what are they supposed to be doing now. And in a lot of positions, people actually said, like, I didn't know what that was, but then I have to figure out what my role is and how I can best engage with it. Then, of course, sense-making through comparison. So here, people are looking at examples of good practices, and the university that was mentioned the most often was the University of Glasgow that has a research culture lab. People are saying, oh, these are the leaders, and now everybody else is following. And finally, sense-making through audit. So here, the interviewee said that REF will be the kind of formulation of research culture. And here's I think my favorite quote from the entire project. A senior lecturer in geosciences said, I don't want to sound like a super cynic because I'm not coming from like a really cynical place on it, but more of a pragmatic point of view of thinking it doesn't really matter that I create some kind of idea or have some preconception of what so research culture means. At some point, I'm going to be told what it means to me in my place of employment. And at that point, I'll just be like, okay, fine, that's what it means now. And we'll kind of get it from there. So it was basically a way of making sense by saying, I'll just wait to see what the ref says and how my institution is going to interpret the ref's definition. So the sense-making processes then led to frames emerging around research culture, which now I'm going to discuss a couple of them. However, I have to say that these are not even all of them, but they're the ones that are kind of were the most common and were kind of the most spread. The underpinning idea of science and research was actually quite interesting because implicitly, all of the interviewees discussed the research culture in terms of problems or shortcomings of the existing research culture. So when I ask people what is research culture, they would start saying what is wrong with research culture without me prompting them into this direction. Explicitly, some of the interviewees actually engaged in this deficit model, and they saw it as a risk that would shape the funders' and institutions' approach to just focusing on the shortcomings and then seeing research culture as basically a long list of things that has to be fixed, and once they're fixed, we're done. So the framing process was actually through negatives. So framings of research culture are directly linked to the question of what is missing in the culture right now. And here I have a quote from one of the interviewees who actually explicitly engaged with this idea of deficit. And they said, if you think about culture just generally, it's normally mentioned as something that people want to preserve in quite a small c conservative way. And any notion of culture changing is seen by some as wonderful and progressive and by others as bad and scary. Do you think the same things translate into research culture? We'll end up with a deficit model around things that will be perceived as desirable, and it becomes, you need more of this, so tick the box and get that in. So this is this idea that actually looking at just deficit in research culture can lead into a tick boxing exercise through audit. Okay. So the frames I'm going to discuss now will then focus on what is the meaning of research culture, but also what is the underpinning problem. So what is the deficit that this frame is trying to capture? And the frame that was the most common, but also one that people were the most dissatisfied with, was seeing research culture as an umbrella. And multiple interviewees actually used the metaphor of an umbrella to capture what research culture is. So the meaning of culture here is that it's an umbrella term capturing a variety of practices and initiatives, such as research integrity, reward and recognition, EDI, interdisciplinarity, impact, early career research issues, working environment, and so on. So the view of research culture was one of composite. The problem here that is underpinning this view of research culture is that there are challenges associated with each one of these dimensions. So that basically means that research culture is everything and everything is wrong with everything. Importantly, issues were happening at different scales because they could happen on the team level, department level, and field level. So research culture was seen as this collapse of all the scales into one concept. Which of course led to challenges when it comes to governing, because it means that it is too big to define and capture, too complex to be governable. And a couple of interviews also highlighted the issue of diffuse responsibility, especially on the funding side, where they said, it could be our responsibility, but also then universities then object the fact that we're imposing research culture on them, but the universities themselves then don't want to take the responsibility on all these areas of research culture that is captured by this umbrella. So here we have a quote from a professional services employee who said that Wellcome kind of allowed us to bring some of that together and start to reflect on, well, what are we doing more broadly, and how does the research development agenda and the other things like research integrity and EDI, how do those all start to kind of blend into one, and how might they come under a more useful complementary umbrella? However, the issue here is that not all of the elements of the umbrella were weighed equally. And time and again, interviewees highlighted that then research culture very often would just mean EDI, another term of the EDI. So here we have a person who said people have tended to bundle research culture and EDI together quite closely. And I think that could be problematic because EDI is such an important multidimensional thing on its own. And then they said they use the terms interchangeably has its problems because either people just assume that you're talking about EDI and therefore don't give it enough attention to the other elements of research culture, or it all just gets kind of muddled. So this kind of capture of EDI over this umbrella means that on the one hand, EDI gets depoliticized because it just have a nicer, less controversial term, but on the other hand, it also means that all the other elements of the umbrella might be seen as kind of not as important in kind of secondhand, just mentioned, rather than on the EDI that kind of captures the whole thing. The second frame was just basically looking at research culture as research. So that's the kind of epistemic view of research culture. One of the interviewees said, the culture means what and how do we research? So then the underpinning problem that the research culture is supposed to solve is the things like research integrity, the increased competition, lack of security, lack of creativity and innovation, the narrow meaning of excellence. And the key challenge then for research culture initiatives is to just fix research practices. And here, this frame was very often linked to the idea of governing through research assessment, that if we fix research evaluation systems, the research culture will also be fixed. And here we have a quote from the person working in medicine as a kind of academic research culture lead, who said, "For me, it's the environment that we work in and how it enables and encourages and facilitates research. The message we often get is, research culture is just about giving everyone a hug, making people feel good," which is really disappointing because it's not about making everyone feel warm and fuzzy. It's about a shared understanding of what excellence look like, and then practically making this a place where that can happen for everyone. And this tension between people and excellence was very relevant here. The more instrumentalist version of that frame was a frame of research culture as a means to an end. So here, research culture was seen as a thing that enables desired outcomes, usually the outcomes seen in terms of grant capture or having increased funding. So the problem that the research culture was supposed to fix is that existing research culture is a barrier to the types of creativity and innovation that enable big grant capture. Research culture is required by the funders, so we have to engage in it, or it was often presented as a managerial challenge and constraint. So people would say, I'm the head of the department, I'm the head of the school, therefore I would love to focus on more making people happy and happy with their environment. However, I have these external metrics that I have to comply with. So here, a quote that really captures this idea was that I used to work as a team lead as a part of my job, and part of my job was analysis of different directions and opportunities. We soon realized that you cannot win the grants, especially the large-scale investments, without considering the issues that are now referred to as research culture. So in a way, it became a part of my job. So you can see that fixing research is a means to an end, which is getting big investments and winning more money. And finally, the most lovely definition of research culture, seeing it as a set of relationships. So here, the meaning of research culture was basically relationships and interactions between researchers within their fields. So this is kind of people-centered view of culture. It came with a lot of problems. So some aspects of academia are damaging to these relationships. So people mention things like overwork, increased competition. This frame was difficult to sustain and scale up, so people didn't really have an answer how that would translate into policies. Both positive and negative relationships are reproduced across different agoras. So people through relationships of mentoring, through being part of the journals, but also grant assessment panels, basically reproduce the ideas and the relationships, and but also people are socialized into thinking about the field in specific ways. Overall, that was kind of ungovernable element of the research culture because a lot of it was basically invisible to the even understanding of people who are discussing it. And here I have a very lovely quote, again from medicine, of someone who responded with an anecdote about how do they understand research culture. And this person said, "Our field has been, for a while, by good fortune for us, dominated by a small number of groups, most of whom were in Britain, a few of whom were in the States, all of whom were good friends, and we shared an enormous amount of information. I went to a meeting in California about 15 years ago, and the last speaker, because it's a field that started small, had grown enormous, and it was gathering people from other fields. The last speaker at that meeting was a woman none of us has ever seen before. She opened her talk by standing up and saying, 'This meeting is extraordinary. I've never been anywhere before where so many people were talking about unpublished results. So that person said, this is open science. The open science is actually trusting people who you know, who you're friends with, and who you work in as a kind of small, very well-connected group. Okay, so what can we learn from these multiple and sometimes contradictory frames of research culture? I think the key thing here is that research culture at this moment, at this pre-auditable moment, is actually an incomplete frame. So the definitions are not agreed upon. However, the strategies are being put in place. So the actions are already happening. The policy is already rolling. However, it doesn't mean that there's an agreement upon what actually do we mean by research culture. And these tensions and contradictions were across the frames. So the key one, that was discussed the most often, was the tension between improving research excellence and improving working lives. And on the one hand, it could be seen as this kind of traditional and perhaps not very constructive way of thinking about research, that, good research comes from struggle, and actually, you have to work 80 hours a week in order to have good outcomes, which obviously, as a research culture movement, wants to kind of break with. However, people also saw this tension between improving excellence and improving working lives as something much more nuanced. For example, saying things like, we want to have more interdisciplinary research because that's how we understand excellence here. However, we understand that that means that the careers of people engaging in it, especially early career researchers, would be much more challenging because the entire reward and recognition system works against them. So we are consciously choosing a kind of harder pathways for some of us in order to have what we consider to be excellent research. The second dimensional struggle was that some of the actions that were supposed to be improved or challenged by the research culture movement, if you may, was the fact that some of them were invisible. So some of these things were actually deeply embedded through norms, through practices that were not easily expressible by researchers, but also professional services. The third tension was around the fact that the ref was seen as a driver of culture change, but also as a barrier. So a lot of things that people consider to be shortcomings of the current academic culture were caused, at least according to them, by the ref itself. So things around security, around narrowing down the types of outcomes that are being published, the constraints on creativity were assigned to ref. But on the other hand, people said, oh, now there's investment, there's going to be money coming from the research culture, and it's now going to be transformed into the field. And finally, this tension between research culture and EDI as the kind of both competing but sometimes overlapping areas that poses a risk to both research culture and EDI. Importantly, there were gaps between the frames, and some of them were very difficult to kind of employ them both or find a measure or a way to actually assess research culture that would comply with these frames. So the contradictory frames, especially around people-centered and kind of excellence-centered understanding of research culture in terms of practices, values, but also theories of change, of how culture change, were not kind of compatible. The current kind of state of research culture shows a picture of complexity without one dominant frame. So we have complexity and focus and political pressures, which means that these conditions of possibility of audit are actually kind of very much top-down and enhanced by policy and political ideas, which means that, as we know from kind of policy studies, that if we have a situation in which there's a lot of pressure and motivation for something to happen without a clear ideas, that means that it opens up a space for entrepreneurs that they can very easily take on kind of leadership role. And an example of Royal Society's definition of research culture was a good example here, right? So because that was the only clear definition, everybody just latched on it. But that also means that there's a really high risk of reactivity to ref. So the field will be standardized by ref definition, and there's now not a strong enough kind of counterbalance or alternative ways of thinking about research culture that would be strong enough to kind of ensure that there is a diversity of practices, diversity of frames. And finally, there's a risk of research culture becoming just a managerial tool. it already is an indication that that's the direction of it. If we look at the kind of clarity of professional services and managers and vagueness of actual researchers. And I think that opens the scope for disciplinary politics. So I think this is a really good time for having disciplinary debates over how do different disciplines see research culture and what is the value that we kind of want to protect throughout the development of the audit. And finally, I think there's an important role here of societies to actually take part into this debate over research culture. A couple of examples, for example, in the people-centered frame of research culture of positive changes were actually driven by societies, for example, across how we understand fieldwork or what are the standards that the researchers should comply with as a kind of positive changes to research culture. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to give the mic to Shir.
Thank you so much, Justina, for your excellent talk. And then now we have time for some Q&A for both the online audience and also people in this room. So can I ask if there's any questions from the room now while I wait for people to put in your comments in the chat areas, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question for Justina. Yes, please.
Really enjoyed that. I was just wondering if you ask people about kind of behaviours, because I guess sometimes when we're asked about an abstract term, it can be quite difficult to define. But do you try and get at research culture through actually asking about specific behaviours? And if so, was there similar complexity, or was there a different picture there?
So Justina, before you answer the question, because I'm not sure if online audience will be able to pick up everything Rachel asked, if you would briefly summarize the question and answer that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So the question was whether I asked or whether the people mentioned behaviors rather than just kind of abstract concepts around research culture. So yes, and I was actually trying to push people because I was not entirely satisfied with I don't know, it's something, maybe Brett will tell us. But when people were mentioning behaviors, they would say things that were kind of very local to them. So they would say oh, we have a good research culture because we have a change in the head of school and this one is much more engaging. Or things oh, we have a really strong team here and we always go to lunch and then we have conversations over lunch and that's really great research culture. Or they would, in kind of more extreme cases, so there was a person who was working in the field that recently went through kind of a scandal with sexual harassment, and a research culture that she was discussing was in terms of how are you citing people or how are you hiring people and how we create spaces for people to be open about their experiences and create space for complaint, basically. So that was a completely different way of thinking about research culture, but also there was one that was not necessarily kind of sector level. So when people were asked about behaviors, they were necessarily talking about what they do, but they wouldn't say that, oh, I'm doing research culture through this. They would say oh, we really love having discussions and debates over our recent projects and stuff like that.
Thank you so much. And there's a question from the online audience. So can I invite Stephanie to ask your question, please? And then I'll need the moment to turn on the volume in the room. So Stephanie. So Stephanie, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah.
Thank
Can you hear me? Hello? No, that doesn't seem to be working.
It's working.
Oh, it is working. Okay. So I'm just interested in the idea of framing you're using. And I've used the idea of framing as Judith Butler uses it, and it always raises the question of who is excluded in a frame and what do we not see. So what do you see as maybe falling by the wayside or being made invisible by current framings or upcoming managerial framings?
Yeah, thanks. So okay, I'm good to go. So I think in terms of what's excluded, So I think definitely the kind of the darkest areas of research culture are not the ones that are necessarily like discussed out in the open. So when people talk about research culture, they very rarely think about the kind of extremes. And so things like abuse or kind of institutionalized racism were not things that were mentioned as kind of parts of the definition of research culture. The way I use framing is slightly more aligned with kind of policy analysis. So just thinking about what is the problem basically represented to be, and what kind of governing structures are responding to that. So how can we think about like what is the implicit solution to the problem? But as I said, the issue is that a lot of elements of research culture are actually not spoken about, and either because they're taken for granted or because people don't feel like this is this within the scope of what the research culture is. But I think definitely with narrowing down of research culture, once it's being assessed, once there's kind of dimensions of their being measured, I think these areas are like who's excluded and what kind of practices are going to be excluded is going to become even a bigger thing, because the audit is going to sharpen but also narrow down the understanding. So I think possibly like in a year or two, we'll see this actual scope of exclusion that is happening because everybody's just going to focus on ref, like one of my interviewees said.
Thank you so much, Justina. And there are a couple of questions coming up, so I'll be inviting participants online to ask their questions first. And as mentioned, we will have some time for discussion in the room if needed after the session. And then, so firstly, can I invite Nasra to ask your question, please? And apologies in advance if I'm not pronouncing your names correctly. Please feel free to correct me. Would you like to speak? Nasra, are you here with us? So if not, I can read out the question. The question was, how can research culture adapt to emerging technology?
I'm not sure what types of technology this question is about. So because I think it would depend. Yeah, so sorry, I don't have an answer here because it would depend on what technology are we talking about.
It's okay, thank you. And then can I invite Monica to ask your question, please? Monica, are you
Hi.
here with us? And would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Justina. That was wonderful. And as I'm working in this field, really stimulating to hear your insights and what you're doing. I was just wondering whether you had looked a bit around the tensions or the differences between say those who work in applied versus non-applied disciplines, and or between those working in more quantitative versus qualitative type of research. If there are any differences or tensions around how the concept and the frames for research culture are being shaped and metricized in particular.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Monica. So I think there are not significant differences. I wouldn't say it was like super strict. So in my other area of research is impact, where like you can see very strict disciplinary boundaries around how people understand and what emerges as a concept. One area that really stood out was medical sciences, which were much more, I'm going to use advanced in kind of quotation marks. So the debates there were much more precise. People were much more familiar with what research culture is. They also had a kind of almost ready to go answer what is wrong with the current research culture. Another area that was also quite active was psychology, because of the debates around reproducibility. So that was also very strongly linked to research culture. I think just anecdotally, kind of very qualitative humanities researchers were basically thinking about research culture in completely different terms. I'm not saying that they didn't think about it, but they were much more heavily drawing on kind of standard definitions of what is culture and how like it basically doesn't change, right? And things like that, rather than actually identifying specific issues or specific things that would be kind of fixable. So I would say, yeah, medicine and psychology were the areas that were the most kind of instrumental in identifying issues and identifying possible solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justina. And then we have another question from Delgado. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning from Pittsburgh. I'm Jorge Delgado. So very interesting presentation about research culture. So I see like the idea of research culture twofold, as something that happens and is created through the interactions in research circumstances or conditions or settings, and also something that leadership, for example, wants to achieve or promote in research settings. So in which ways do you see the findings of your research applied?
Yeah, so I'm not going to have a super satisfactory answer to that because it was highlighted as a tension, but there were not kind of clear solutions because so that's something that I've mentioned as a tension between people and excellence. So people in kind of managerial positions that I've interviewed said that this is one of the things that they struggle with in terms of research culture, that they would like to support and encourage kind of positive research culture and creating great spaces for researchers and very kind of productive environments. However, they're also constrained by these like external measures and what they have to report and how they're being basically assessed. So I think in that sense, the kind of more qualitative a lived experience of how people would envision their workplaces to work and what kind of research they would like to do. We're kind of constrained by this kind of performance measurement culture, and how do they see they have to externalize the ideas to this very vaguely defined others, either the kind of higher management levels or kind of the sector.
Can I counter argue or ask another question? So it's interesting because we can cross the idea of research culture with the idea of social representations, meaning the perspective of social psychology, how depending on your position or where you're located in research and a research setting or circumstances, you can also have different ideas of what research culture is. So when you talk about excellence, it's a very good one, because it's like a term that you see everywhere, but even everybody can take. So thank you. It's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then moving on to the next question, can I invite Vicky to ask your questions, please?
Thank you very much, Justina. So I'd be interested to know to what extent you think that the risk around REF starting to narrow the definition of research culture might be mitigated by collaborating with non-UK contexts and perhaps comparing definitions of research cultures in different parts of the world. And I'd be interested to know if anyone's got any inputs on how research culture is interpreted outside the UK.
Yeah, good to go. Yeah, thanks, Vicky. I think it's a great question. And I think the funniest response that I've gotten was that it is from someone working in the European context, that the UK is seen as one of the leaders alongside the Netherlands in debates over research culture, but they said it's typically for the UK that they turned it into a competition. So we're going to compete who's the best in the research culture. I think other understandings from policymakers who work on the European level focus slightly more on issues around responsible assessment, and there's a broader debate around reward and recognition systems as a research culture. So it's slightly more narrow, but also slightly more specific than what we have right now. Although, yeah, it's all up in the air, right? So it's been thrown up, and now we're going to see what's going to land in the next ref. Unfortunately, I should say that this is I think that's my third project when I don't ask people about ref and they're talking about ref.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky and Justina. And then we have another question from Wahid. Can I invite you to speak and ask your question, please?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Am I audible? Okay, so my question is more related to actually application of research culture within the different units. So what are the different level where we can apply the research culture, and actually then who are the the promote the or strengthen the research culture within these different level of organization or country level? So this is my question.
Yes, I think it's a really good question because in my research, people basically discuss things happening across the scale. So they would say research culture is what happens on the disciplinary field level. People would say research culture happens at the university level, department level. Our team has a research culture. My colleagues are responsible for research culture. I don't know who is responsible or who should be responsible. However, what I know is that I also ask people what changes research culture and at what level the change happens. And here the most common answer was that line managers are actually the ones who are the most responsible for culture change. And that the second one was basically skipping a couple of levels of the scale, that on the field level. So if, especially as I said, around the issues with like harassment and so on, they said like it has to happen on the level of the field in order for us to see change, which I think is not a very satisfactory answer. I'm trying to make it concrete, but I think it points to the challenge with the research culture that it happens everywhere and it changes through every mean, right? So we have multiple different pathways for change, and also it occurs on like the level from the individual all the level to the system. So it's very difficult to actually capture what change happens and how it happens and how this particular system actually evolves. So yeah, it's not a satisfactory answer, but I think it's just pointing to the more kind of complexity of what's out there.
Thank you very much, Justina. And we also received a comment in the chat from Monica. So Monica, would you like to speak a little bit more about your sharing, or?
I mean, it was just in case it was of interest because it was just published today, basically. So it was just that I really resonated with me when you were talking about sort of that tension of improving kind of the idea of excellence in research and the conduct of research versus that tension with working environments and career progression and all the kind of things that we're all very accustomed to hear. And this is something that, you know, in our work that we're doing at the University of Oxford is very much at the forefront, that we have this sort of you know, different approaches, and there's no just like one idea of research culture, but we're trying to do like approach a lot of these challenges, and it's always very hard to define this as one thing. And we face that challenge both in terms of how we communicate the work that we do to researchers, the sort of structures that are needed in the university to be able to implement them, and also in terms of the organizational structure for implementing research culture. So all the kind of background stuff that happens in committees and that kind of thing, that's also really challenging because it cuts across so many different things, and everyone wants to take control of their own part. EDI, the HR, the I don't know, the open access and open research, data management, whatever it is, they all have their own kind of structures, and it's very kind of hard to try and see how we can tackle these challenges from a unified perspective. So yeah, it was just sharing a bit of what came out today about what we're trying to conceive as research culture and what we're trying to do.
Great. Thanks, Monica. It was breaking news. First time happening in a seminar.
And I understand that Justina, you also mentioned about the analysis of institutional documents, and would you like to share a bit more about that as well?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of movement across the Russell group. That is the only kind of part that I have a look at in terms of research culture. And it's actually quite interesting because it is both definitely it's a movement towards homogenizing it, so everybody's doing the same things, but also in a slightly different way. So it is a very interesting tension between basically mimicry to the leaders that I've mentioned, but also trying to kind of identify different ways that were already happening, for example, and now are being relabeled as research culture. So things around employee development or research integrity or open science are now being kind of moved around structures. But there's definitely something that in terms of professionalization, that it is a trend across the Russell group, that there are many positions around research culture, and it is becoming part of the kind of institutionalized management structures.
So I think like there are no more chats or comments or questions from the only, oh, there's one more. Ian, would you like to speak, please? So there's a comment from colleague, and I wonder if you'd like to speak, Ian, about that. Or if not, I will read it out for people in this room as well. So, oh, would you like to speak? I can see that you've tried to unmute. If not, I will read it out. So Ian said that research culture has changed. It has moved away from a link to teaching, and it has become less autonomous and, oh, sorry.
Right, I've now found where to open my mic. So yes, I can take over if you want.
Please proceed.
All right, let me say I've stopped in the last 18 months, but I started in the early 1990s researching the impact of research assessment, as it was then, and therefore have monitored shifts in research culture. And as I said, there have been certain policy prescriptions from government, certain expectations about change in organisation culture. And one of my research areas, universities, is organisation cultures. And the pressures that researchers have seen and survival strategies have led them to these things that I talk about or write about. The harmony that was seen between research and teaching, I think, has gone. I do quite a lot of my research is informed by my teaching rather than my teaching being informed by my research. But there is an iteration. I think the research has been integrated more into university strategy. Research used to be autonomous. There's a principle that was established early in the last century, the name of which I forget, but that research should be defined and conducted by researchers. That no longer happens. There is a programme that the university will have into which researchers fit. And there's been an issue about impact and knowledge exchange, and therefore, again, the balance of the kind of research that is done is less blue skies and much closer to operationality. Whereas in the early days of the research excellence assessment, applicability and applied research was deemed of second order. Now it has moved to being, I think, of much more a prime order. So there are other things as well. It evolves as the system evolves and as the strategies and the policies from government evolve.
Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you very much for your comment. I wonder, Justina, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So I can respond very briefly, because actually one of the elements of this project was also to look at impact as a case of change in culture. So actually, when the research impact has been introduced in the ref, there was like explicit reference to culture change. And one of the things that I've studied was also looking at research impact as an example of culture change. And that's definitely one that is kind of noticeable and traceable. So things like the underpinning understanding of the relationship between science and policy is completely changed. So I compared the data I collected now, the data I've collected in 2016, and for example, the kind of the idea of research as kind of linear projects, you know, that like you're going to do research and you can leave it, and if it's good enough, it's going to be picked up and transferred, translated into impact, basically completely disappeared. So people no longer discuss it in these terms. So the understanding of impact as a kind of interactive thing that you have to actually actively work towards is the kind of predominant thing. And I think this is an important cultural change. Yeah, I'm going to stop here because I've realized that we're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And David, I can see your comments. Okay, so I'll leave the comments there. And thank you so much to Justina again for a wonderful presentation, as well as some really insightful discussions. And thank you everyone for your inputs and questions for coming. We've had, I think, at some time over 80 participants online. So please also, if you're interested in other CG events, please check out the CG websites, and the next webinar will be on next Tuesday. You're welcome to join us again. And with that, thank you so much everyone. Take care, and we'll see you around.